Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. We're digging into some pretty significant developments in the Ukraine war. All these articles you've sent in about Ukraine taking the fight right to Russia's doorstep.
Yeah, it's been a pretty remarkable shift, hasn't it? I mean, we're seeing Ukraine move from a mostly defensive posture to a much more proactive and, dare I say, offensive strategy.
And it seems like more than just pushing back, right? Like they're really going after the heart of Russia's ability to even wage war.
That's right. It's not just about reclaiming territory anymore. It's about systematically dismantling Russia's military machine, uh, crippling their capacity to sustain this conflict.
So we're talking about what? Like hitting supply lines, taking
Yeah.
out key infrastructure?
Oh, much more than that. We're talking about attacks on oil refineries, hundreds of miles from the front lines, a microelectronics plant that makes, get this, components for missiles, even a liquefied natural gas facility.
Wow, a gas facility.
Yeah, run by Gazprom, no less. I mean, that's a major source of revenue for Putin.
So this is hitting them where it hurts, economically as well as militarily.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I've seen this term triple tap strategy being thrown around. And honestly, I'm not a military strategist.
No.
Break it down for me. What exactly does that look like?
Well, it's actually pretty straightforward. It's a three-pronged approach. So first, they use long-range drones, right, to scout, identify targets, deep inside Russia.
So it's like reconnaissance.
Exactly, recon. Then they hit those targets with a combination of long-range missiles, like the U.S.-supplied ATACMS and the British Storm Shadow missiles. Those are pretty powerful.
Okay, and that's the second tap.
Right. And then they follow up with another barrage, another wave of drones and missiles, often targeting the same locations.
Oh, wow, so they're hitting them multiple times.
Exactly. Maximize the damage, overwhelm Russian defenses. It really keeps them on their toes.
And they've pulled this off 3 times in just 2 weeks.
It's a bold move for sure.
It is. But let's talk about those targets. Why are these specific locations so strategically important? When you mentioned the oil refineries.
Right. Well, those are absolutely essential. You got to fuel those tanks and planes and ships, right?
Right.
And oil exports, major source of income for Russia. So hitting those refineries, it directly impacts their ability to fund the war.
So it's a 2-for-1, crippling the war machine and hitting them in the wallet.
You got it. And there's also the psychological impact. I mean, imagine you're a Russian citizen living 700 miles from the front lines, and suddenly an oil refinery in your backyard gets blown up.
Yeah.
It sends a message. Nowhere is safe.
Definitely shatters any sense of normalcy.
Exactly. And it also demonstrates Ukraine's growing reach, right? Their capabilities, that they can strike deep inside Russia at will.
That's got to have a psychological impact, not just on Putin, but on everyday Russians.
No question about it. Now, another key target, we've got to talk about this, ammunition depots.
Okay, right.
Ukraine has actually managed to destroy a significant number of these stockpiles. And not just any old ammo. We're talking glide bombs, cruise missiles, the very weapons Russia has been using, to terrorize Ukrainian cities.
Right, those devastating attacks.
Yeah.
So this reduces the immediate threat to civilians, but it also
forces Russia to rely more heavily on artillery shells they're getting from, get this, North Korea.
Oh, wow. That's
Yeah, it's a sign, isn't it?
that their own production's not keeping up.
It says a lot about the state of their domestic production capabilities.
So they're not just reacting to the current situation, but they're thinking long-term, trying to limit Russia's ability to wage war even into the future.
That's right. And this long-term thinking, we see it in the attacks on chemical and microelectronics plants, too.
Okay, and these produce?
Explosives, components for artillery shells, missiles, even air defense systems.
Oh, wow. So taking these out is a lot.
Big deal, right? It doesn't just deplete their current stockpiles. It weakens their ability to replenish them. And that's going to impact their military capabilities for years to come.
Wow. It's like they're saying, we're not just going to win this war, but we're going to make sure you can't start another one.
That's one way to put it. It's a bold strategy. It's a potentially game-changing strategy. But it's not without risks. We've got to talk about the potential blowback, too.
Right, because Russia isn't just going to sit there and take it. What has their response been so far?
Well, their immediate reaction, not surprising really, was missile and drone attacks targeting Ukraine's power grid.
Aimed at civilians, really. Trying to inflict as much pain as possible, especially with winter coming on.
It's a brutal tactic, yeah. Sadly, not a new one, though.
No, not at all. But it raises the question, doesn't it? Is Ukraine risking, a major escalation by striking so deep inside Russia? I mean, is this poking the bear a bit too much?
It's definitely a gamble, there's no question. I mean, Putin has already shown he's more than willing to target civilians critical infrastructure, those attacks on the power grid, a clear attempt to break the Ukrainian people's will. And there's a real concern that, he could lash out even more unpredictably as the pressure mounts.
It's a chilling thought. But then on the other hand, Ukraine is arguing that they have to hit back hard, that this is the only way to deter further aggression.
Yeah, that's the crux of their argument, isn't it? They're essentially saying passive defense won't cut it. Russia needs to feel the pain of this war on their own soil to have any real incentive to negotiate. And they're pointing to the fact that despite Russia's claims of shooting down most of those drones and missiles, the damage is there.
Right, and those decoy drones must be messing with their air defenses pretty effectively, too.
I'm curious, though, about the long-term impact of all of this. Aside from the human cost, which is obviously immense, how badly are these attacks actually hurting Russia economically? Well, it's definitely making a dent, there's no question. I mean, the loss of oil refining capacity, storage facilities, that directly translates to lower export revenue. And remember, Russia's already facing those significant sanctions from the West, so these attacks, they just compound the economic strain.
So a double whammy, really. Reduced production and limited access to markets, not to mention the just skyrocketing cost of this war.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, every missile, every drone, every soldier deployed, it's a drain on their resources, and those are already strained. And this economic pressure, it could ultimately become a decisive factor. Putin can't keep funding a war indefinitely if the money runs out.
Speaking of bold moves, let's talk about Ukraine's decision to stop that flow of Russian gas to the EU through its pipelines. I mean, that seems pretty risky, doesn't it, considering Europe's reliance on Russian energy, especially during the winter?
It's certainly a risky move, no question about it. But it's also a powerful statement, isn't it? It's Ukraine saying, we will no longer be complicit in funding your war machine, cutting off a major source of revenue for Russia, even if it means some hardship for their European allies.
Yeah, it's a message to Europe, too, isn't it? Ukraine's serious about breaking free from Russian dependence, and they need their support in finding those alternative energy sources.
Precisely, asserting their agency, refusing to be a pawn in this geopolitical game.
But then you have those devastating attacks on the power grid. It's clearly an attempt, by Russia to just terrorize civilians and just force Ukraine to surrender. So does this raise the question then, will these attacks actually break the Ukrainian people's spirit?
If history is any indication, I highly doubt it. I mean, Ukrainians have shown incredible resilience and defiance in the face of this aggression. They've rallied together, supported each other, and they've just shown this fierce determination to defend their country.
It seems like these attacks might even have the opposite effect, don't they? Galvanizing international support and further isolating Russia on the global stage.
You're right. You're absolutely right. I mean, the images of those attacks, the stories of families huddled in the dark and cold, they don't exactly win Russia any sympathy points, do they? In fact, they just reinforce that narrative of Russia as the aggressor, the villain in this story.
It's a really complex situation, isn't it? Ukraine making these bold moves to defend itself, Russia responding with just brutality, and the whole world kind of watching on the edge of their seats. So what happens next? What should our listeners be paying attention to in all of this?
Well, I think one of the biggest questions right now is, can Ukraine keep this up? Can they sustain this level of offensive action? They've inflicted some pretty serious damage, no question. But these long-range strikes, those require sophisticated weapons, intelligence, logistical support. It's not easy to keep that going.
And a lot of that support is coming from the West, right? From the U.S. and European allies.
Exactly. And it's not just weapons and ammo. We're talking financial aid, too, to keep the Ukrainian government functioning, keep the economy from totally collapsing. And the longer this war drags on, well, the more crucial that sustained support becomes, because it's not going to be cheap.
And then there's the question of how Russia reacts, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen the retaliation, the attacks on the power grid. But could Putin escalate even further? I mean, could he target neighboring countries that are helping Ukraine? I mean, that's a scary thought.
It's a very real concern. I mean, Putin's options, they're narrowing. And as the pressure mounts, he might be tempted to lash out, do something unpredictable, ramp up cyber attacks, intensify those attacks on civilian infrastructure, or even, try to provoke NATO directly, by targeting supply lines in Poland, Romania, something like that.
That's a terrifying thought. And it really highlights just how delicate this whole situation is, doesn't it? I mean, any miscalculation, any overreaction, it could have just catastrophic consequences.
It absolutely could. And that's why it's so crucial for the international community to stay united. Continued diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, military aid to Ukraine, all of that. It's essential to deterring further Russian aggression.
So in a way, it's not just about the outcome in Ukraine, is it? I mean, it's about sending a message
Yeah.
that this kind of blatant aggression, it won't be tolerated anywhere in the world.
Right. If Putin gets away with this, it sets a dangerous precedent. I mean, think about it. Other authoritarian leaders, who might be tempted to use force to get what they want. It's a slippery slope. The stakes are incredibly high, not just for Ukraine, but for global security,
Yeah,
the future of democracy itself. It's a lot to think about.
it is. It really is. And it
Yeah.
feels like the situation is constantly evolving. So what's your advice for our listeners? I mean, how can they make sense of all of this?
Well, first of all, be wary of propaganda. Be wary of disinformation. I mean, both sides are trying to control the narrative, right? So get your information from reputable sources. Be critical of everything you read, everything you hear, and don't underestimate the power of individual action. Stay informed. Talk to your elected officials. Support humanitarian organizations that are helping Ukrainian refugees. Every little bit helps.
Well said. And remember, even in the darkest of times, there's always hope. The Ukrainian people have shown just incredible courage and resilience. Their determination to fight for their freedom is really an inspiration to the world.
It's a reminder, isn't it, that even when the odds seem stacked against you, the human spirit can prevail.
This has been a sobering deep dive, but an incredibly insightful one. So thank you for helping us unpack. It's a really complex situation. And to our listeners, stay informed, stay engaged, stay hopeful. The world needs your critical thinking, your compassion now more than ever.